Saussure, after half a century, by Émile Benveniste. Ferdinand de Saussure died February 22, 1913. Here we are, gathered together 50 years later, on the same date, the 22nd of February 1963, for a special commemoration in his city and in his university. His figure now takes on its authentic character and appears to us in its true grandeur. There is not a linguist today who does not owe him something. There is not a general theory which does not mention his name. Some mystery surrounded his actual life, since he so early retired into silence. It is his work we shall deal with. The only fitting eulogy for such a work is that which explains its origins and causes its influence to be understood. Today we see Saussure completely different from the way his contemporaries could see him. A whole part of him, undoubtedly the most important, was not known until after his death. The science of human speech was gradually changed by him. What is it that Saussure brought to the linguistics of his day, and how has he influenced ours? In order to answer that question, one could go from one of his works to the other, analyzing, comparing, and discussing them. A critical inventory like that is undoubtedly necessary. The admirable and important work of Robert Godel has contributed greatly to this. But this is not our purpose. Leaving to others the detailed description of that work, we shall try to recapture its basic principles in the drive which animated and even formed it. There is in every creative person a certain drive, hidden and permanent, which sustains him and devours him, guides his thoughts, directs him to his task, spurs him on when he lapses, and shows him no quarter when he attempts to evade it. It is not always to be recognized in the different stages, sometimes tentative, in which Saussure's thought was engaged. But once it has been discerned, it illuminates the meaning of his effort and situates him with regard to his predecessors as well as with respect to us. Saussure was first and always a man of fundamentals. He went instinctively to the most basic characteristics which govern the diversity of the empirical datum. In the sphere of language, he suspected the existence of certain qualities which were not met with anywhere else. No matter what it was compared to, language always appeared as something different. But how was it different? Considering that activity, human speech, in which so many factors are brought together, biological, physical, and psychic, individual and social, historical, aesthetic, and pragmatic, he asked himself, where does language properly belong? A more precise form could be given to this question by connecting it to the two following problems, which we see as being at the center of Saussure's teaching. 1. What are the basic data on which linguistics is to be grounded, and how can we grasp them? 2. What is the nature of the notions of human speech, and by what mode of relationship are they articulated? This preoccupation can be discerned in Saussure from the moment of his entrance into the science in his Mémoire sur le système primitif des voyelles dans les langues indo-européennes, published when he was 21 years old and still one of his titles to fame. The brilliant novice attacked one of the most difficult problems of comparative grammar, a question which, as a matter of fact, did not yet exist, and which he was the first to formulate in the appropriate terms. Why did he choose, in a field so vast and promising, such a demanding subject? Let us reread his preface. There he shows that his intention had been to study the Indo-European R, but that he had been led to consider the system of vowels as a whole. This led him to treat a series of problems of phonetics and morphology, some of which still await their solution, and several of which have not even been posed. And, as if to excuse himself for having to cross the most unexplored regions of Indo-European linguistics, he adds this illuminating justification. If we have nevertheless ventured to go there, convinced in advance that our inexperience will go astray many times in the labyrinth, it is because for anyone engaged in these studies, attacking such questions is not temerity, as has often been said, but a necessity. It is the first school through which one must pass, for it is not a matter of transcendental speculations, but of the quest for elementary data, without which everything wavers, everything is arbitrariness and incertitude. These last lines could serve as an epigraph to his entire work. They contain the program for his future research. They are portents of his orientation and his goal. Until the end of his life, and more insistently, painfully one might say, the farther he advanced in his thinking, the more he sought for those elementary data which constitute language, turning away gradually from the science of his time in which he saw only arbitrariness and incertitude, and this at a period when Indo-European linguistics, confident of its methods, was following the comparative approach with increasing success. It is indeed the elementary data which must be discovered, even, one would like to write, especially if the purpose is to go back from a historical state of the language to a prehistoric one. Otherwise, the historical development will not have a rational basis, for if there is history, what is it a history of? What changes and what remains the same? How can we say of a linguistic phenomenon considered at two different moments of evolution that it is the same phenomenon? In what does that sameness reside? And since it links for linguists two different objects, how shall we define it? A body of definitions is necessary. We must state the logical connections established within the data, their features, the points of view from which they can be apprehended. To go thus to the fundamentals is the only way, but the sure way, to explain a concrete and contingent fact. In order to reach what is historically concrete, to see the very inevitability of the contingent, we must locate each element in the network of correlations which determines it, and admit explicitly that the fact does not exist except by virtue of the definition which we give it. Such was a conviction that forced itself upon Saussure's mind from the beginning, and which his whole life was not enough to introduce into linguistic theory. But even if he had formulated then what he was to teach later, he would only have deepened the lack of comprehension or hostility with which his first attempts were met. The chief scholars then, confident of their own truth, refused to listen to this rigorous summons, and the very difficulty of the memoir was enough to discourage most of them. Perhaps Saussure would have lost heart. It required another generation for his ideas slowly to make their way. It was a fortunate destiny which took him then to Paris. He recovered some confidence in himself thanks to that remarkable chance which caused him to meet, at the same time, a sympathetic tutor, Bréal, and a group of young linguists like Amélier and M. Cramont, who were to be profoundly influenced by his teaching. A new phase of comparative grammar dates from these years in which Saussure inculcated his doctrine at the same time that he was maturing it among those who were to develop it. That is why we recall, not only to gauge the personal influence of Saussure, but also to assess the progress of the ideas they reveal, The terms of the dedication which Meillet made to his master Saussure in 1903 in his Introduction à l'étude comparative des langues indo-européennes, on the occasion of the 25th year since the publication of the Memoir, 1878-1903. The event would have been more clearly marked if it had been up to Meillet alone. An unpublished letter from Saussure tells us that Meillet had first intended to write for the anniversary of the publication, from which he was dissuaded by Saussure. But even in 1903, that is to say, 25 years after the publication of the Memoir of 1878, it still was not possible to know all the prophetic intuitions it contained. Here is a striking example. Saussure had discerned in the Indo-European vowel system several types of R. In point of pure knowledge, the different Indo-European R's are as important as the fundamental particles in nuclear physics. Now, one of these R's had the singular quality of behaving differently from the other two. Many discoveries have begun with a similar observation: a disagreement with the system, a disturbance in a field, an abnormal movement in an orbit. Saussure characterized this R by two specific traits. On the one hand, it was related to neither E nor O. On the other, it was a semantic coefficient, i.e., it was capable of playing the same double role, vocalic and consonantal, as the nasals and the liquids, and it combined with vowels. Let us note that Saussure spoke of it as a phoneme and not as a sound or an articulation. He did not tell us how this phoneme was pronounced, what sound it approximated in any observable system, or even if it was a vowel or a consonant. The phonic substance was not considered. We are confronted with an algebraic unit, a term of the system, what he would later call a distinguishing and opposing entity. We could not say that this remark attracted much interest even 25 years after it had been published. It required another 25 years for it to compel recognition under circumstances which the most audacious imagination could not have conceived. In 1927, the phoneme that had been defined 50 years before by Saussure as the Indo-European Semantic Phoneme was rediscovered by J. Kurilovics in a historical language, Hittite, which had just then been deciphered under the guise of the sound written as H. This admirable observation made a reality of the theoretical entity postulated by the argument of 1878. Naturally, the phonetic realization of this entity as H in Hittite brought the new element into the debate, but it was of a different nature. From then on, two directions in research appeared. Some endeavored to push further the theoretical investigation and to bring to light, especially in Indo-European, the effects and combinations of this semantic coefficient. Today, one feels that this phoneme is not unique, that it represents a whole class of phonemes called laryngeals, which are unevenly distributed among the historical languages. Other linguists emphasize, on the contrary, the descriptive analysis of these sounds. By this, they seek to define their phonetic features, and since the number of laryngeals is still a matter for discussion, from one year to another interpretations can be seen multiplying and giving rise to new controversies. This problem is today at the center of the theory of Indo-European. It is a matter of passionate interest to the diachronists as well as the descriptivists. All this bears witness to the fruitfulness of Saussure's views, which have been fulfilled only in these last decades, half a century after they were published. Even those modern linguists who have not read the Memoir are still indebted to it. Here then was Saussure, advancing quite young in his career with a mark of greatness in him. welcomed with favor at the École of Haute Étude, where he immediately found disciples whom his thought enchanted and inspired, and at the Société de Linguistics, where Bréal soon made him assistant secretary. A comfortable career opened before him, and everything seemed to herald a long train of discoveries. This expectation was not deceived. Let us recall only the fundamental articles on Baltic intonation, which show the depth of his analysis and remain models for whoever tackles the same research. It is a fact, however, which has been stressed and deplored by those who have had to speak of the Saussure of these years, that soon his productivity slowed down. He confined himself to some more and more infrequent articles, and then only to meet the requests of his friends. When he went back to Geneva to take up a chair at the university, he gradually ceased completely to write. Nevertheless, he never ceased to work. What was it that deterred him from publishing? We are beginning to find out. This silence hid a drama which must have been painful. It was aggravated with the years and never had an outcome. It was partly the result of personal circumstances on which the testimony of his family and friends could shed some light. It was, above all, a drama of the mind. Saussure alienated himself from his period in the same proportion as he made himself more and more master of his own truth, for that truth made him reject everything that was then taught on the subject of language. But while he was hesitating to undertake that radical revision which he felt was necessary, he could not bring himself to publish the slightest note, if he was not assured first of the fundamental basis of the theory. The depths to which this trouble reached, and how many times he was close to becoming discouraged, is revealed in a remarkable document, a passage from a letter to Meek, January 4, 1894, in which he confides a propos of his studies on Baltic intonation. But I am very disgusted with all that, and with the difficulty there is, in general, to write 10 lines concerning the facts of language which have any common sense. I have, for a long time, been especially concerned with the logical classification of these facts, with the classification of the points of view from which we treat them, and I see more and more both the immensity of the work which is necessary to show the linguist what he is doing, by reducing each operation to its previously specified category, and, at the same time, the very great vanity of everything which can ultimately be done in linguistics. It is, ultimately, only the picturesque aspect of a language, that which makes it different from all others in that it belongs to a certain people having certain origins. It is this almost ethnographic aspect which still holds an interest for me, and, as it happens, I no longer can take any pleasure in devoting myself up to this study without remorse, and in enjoying a particular fact which depends on a particular environment. The absolute ineptness of current terminology, the necessity to reform it, and, in order to do that, to show what sort of subject language in general is, come incessantly to spoil my pleasure in history, although I have no dearer wish than not to have to concern myself with language in general. In spite of myself, this will result in a book, in which I shall, without enthusiasm or passion, explain why there is not a single term used in linguistics to which I grant any meaning whatsoever. And I confess that it is not until after that I shall be able to take up my work at the point which I left it. That is a perhaps stupid state of mind, which should explain to Duveau why I have, for example, delayed for more than a year over the publication of an article which does not present any material difficulty. and still I have not succeeded in avoiding expressions which are logically odious, because a decidedly radical reform would be necessary for this. One can see in what sort of argument Saussure was entangled. The more he probed into the nature of human speech, the less he could be satisfied with the accepted ideas. And so he sought a diversion in studies of ethno-linguistic typology, but he was always brought back to his first obsession. Perhaps it was to keep on escaping from it that he threw himself into the ceaseless quest for anagrams. But we see today what was at stake. Saussure's drama was going to transform linguistics. The obstacles his thinking encountered were to force him to forge the new dimensions which would reorder the facts of language. From this moment, indeed, Saussure saw that to study a particular language led inevitably to the study of language in general. We believe we can reach a linguistic phenomenon as an objective reality. Actually, we can grasp it only from a certain point of view, which it is first necessary to define. Let us cease to believe that in language we have to do with a simple object, existing by itself and capable of being grasped in its totality. The first task is to show the linguist what he is doing, what preliminary operations he performs consciously when he approaches linguistic data. Nothing could be more alien to his period than this concern with logic. Linguists were then absorbed in a huge effort of historical investigation, in organizing the comparative materials and in building up stocks of etymologies. These great undertakings, although quite useful, did not leave room for theoretical concerns. Thus Saussure was alone with his problems. The immensity of the task to be accomplished and the radical character of the necessary reform were enough to make him hesitate and sometimes to become discouraged. Nevertheless, he did not give it up. He contemplated a book in which he would say these things, in which he would present his views and undertake the complete overhauling of the theory. The book was never written, but it survives in rough sketches in the form of preparatory notes, remarks tossed out rapidly, and drafts. And when he had to give a course in general linguistics in order to fulfill his obligations to the university, he would take up the same themes and bring them to the point at which we know them. In the linguist of 1910 we find again, in effect, the same purpose which guided the novice of 1880, to establish the basis of linguistics. He rejected the categories and notions which he saw in use everywhere, because they seemed to him to be foreign to the proper nature of language. What was that nature? He explained his position briefly in certain of his notes, fragments of a reflection which could neither be abandoned nor completely settled. Elsewhere, there are things, certain objects, which one is free to consider afterwards from different points of view. In our case, there are primarily points of view, right or wrong, but simply points of view, with the aid of which, secondarily, one creates things. These creations happen to correspond to realities when the point of departure is right, or not to correspond to them in the opposite case, but in both cases no thing, no object is given for a single instant in itself, not even when the most material fact is dealt with, one which would seem most obviously defined in itself, as would be a series of vocal sounds. Here is our profession of faith regarding linguistic matter. In other fields one can speak of things from such or such point of view, certain that one will find oneself again on firm ground in the object itself. in linguistics, we deny in principle that there are given objects, that there are things which continue to exist when one passes from one order of ideas to another, and that one can, as a result, allow oneself to consider things in several orders, as if they were given by themselves. These reflections explain why Saussure considered it so important to show the linguist what he is doing. He wished to make people understand the era in which linguistics had been engaged from the time it began the study of human speech as a thing, or as a living organism, or as a matter to be analyzed by an instrumental technique, or again, as a free and incessant creation of the human imagination. One must get back to the fundamentals and discover that object which is language, to which nothing can be compared. What then was this object which Saussure set up after having made a clean sweep of all accepted notions? Here we touch upon that which is of prime importance in the Saussurean doctrine, upon a principle which assumes a total intuition of language, total, both because it contains the whole of his theory and because it embraces the totality of his subject. This principle is that human speech, no matter from what point of view it is studied, is always a double entity, formed of two parts of which the one has no value without the other. There, it seems to me, is the center of the doctrine, the principle from which proceeds all the array of notions and distinctions that constitute the published course. Everything in language is to be defined in double terms. Everything bears the imprint and seal of an opposing duality. The articulatory acoustical duality, the duality of sound and sense, the duality of the individual and society, the duality of langue and parole, the duality of the material and the immaterial, the duality of the memorial, paradigmatic, and the syntagmatic, the duality of sameness and opposition, the duality of the synchronic and the diachronic, etc. And, once again, none of these terms thus placed in opposition has value by itself or refers to a substantial reality. Each of them takes its value from the fact that it is in opposition to the other. The absolutely final law of language is, we dare say, that there is nothing which can ever reside in one term, as a direct consequence of the fact that linguistic symbols are unrelated to what they should designate, so that A is powerless to designate anything without the aid of B, and the same thing is true of B without the aid of A, or that both have no value except through their reciprocal difference, or that neither has any value, even through a certain part of itself, I suppose the root, etc., other than through the same plexus of eternally negative differences. Since human speech does not present substance in any of its manifestations, but only combined or isolated actions of physiological, psychological, or mental forces, and since, nevertheless, all our distinctions, all our terminology, all our ways of speaking are molded according to that involuntary supposition that there is a substance, one cannot refuse above all to recognize that the theory of language will have as its most essential task the disentangling of the real nature of our primary distinctions. It is impossible for us to agree that one has the right to construct a theory without performing this essential labor of definition, although this convenient way seems up to now to have satisfied the linguistic public. Certainly, a material phenomenon can be taken as the object of a linguistic analysis, for instance, some meaningless segment of an utterance, considered as a simple production of the vocal apparatus, or even an isolated vowel. It is an illusion to believe that here we have hold of a substance, As a matter of fact, it is only by an operation of abstraction and generalization that we can delimit such a topic of study. Saussure insisted upon this, that only the point of view creates the substance. All the aspects of language which we take in as given are the result of logical operations which we employ unconsciously. Let us then become conscious of this. Let us open our eyes to the truth that there is not one single aspect of language which is given without the others, and which one can place above the others as anterior and primordial. Whence this observation? The more one delves into the material proposed for linguistic study, the more one becomes convinced of this truth, which most particularly, it would be useless to conceal it, makes one pause, that the bond established among things is pre-existent in this area to the things themselves, and serves to determine them. This thesis appears paradoxical, and can cause surprise even today. Some linguists reproach Saussure for a propensity to emphasize paradoxes in the functioning of language. But language is actually the most paradoxical thing in the world, and unfortunate are those who do not see this. The further one goes, the more one feels this contrast between oneness as a category of our perception of objects and the pattern of duality which language imposes upon our thought. The more one penetrates into the mechanism of signification, the better one sees that things do not signify by reason of their substantially being so, but by virtue of the formal features which distinguish them from other things of the same class, and which it is incumbent upon us to extract. From these views proceeds the doctrine which the disciples of Saussure put into shape and published. Today, scrupulous exegetes devote themselves to the necessary task of restoring the lessons of Saussure in their exact terms, with the help of all the materials they can recover. Thanks to their pains, we shall have a critical edition of the Cours de Linguistique Générale, which will not only present us with a faithful image of that teaching, as it was transmitted in its oral form, but which will allow the Saussurean terminology to be settled with strict accuracy. This doctrine actually informs, in one way or another, all of the theoretical linguistics of our time. The influence it has had has been enhanced by the effect of the conversion of Saussurean ideas with those of other theorists. Thus, in Russia, Baudouin de Courtenay and his disciple Krusevsky proposed at the same time, but independently, a new concept of the phoneme. They distinguished the linguistic function of the phoneme from its articulatory realization. This teaching approached on a smaller scale the Saussurean distinction between langue and parole, and assigned a differentiating value to the phoneme. This was the first germ of what has developed into a new branch of linguistics, phonology, the theory of the distinctive functions of phonemes and of the structures of their relationships. When they found it, N. Trubetskoy and R. Jacobson expressly recognized Saussure, as well as Baudouin de Courtenay, as their precursors. The structuralist trend, which emerged in 1928 and which was soon to assume major importance, thus had its origins in Saussure. Although he never used the term structure in a doctrinal sense, and it is a term, moreover, which, having had to serve as a banner for very different movements, has finally lost any precise meaning. The dependence on Saussure is unquestionable among all those who seek the pattern of the general structure of linguistic systems in the relationship of phonemes among themselves. It might be useful to stress this point relative to one of these structuralist schools, the one which is most characteristically national, the American school. insofar as it derives from Bloomfield. It is not widely enough known that Bloomfield wrote a very laudatory review of the Cours de Linguistique Générale, in which he gave credit to Saussure for the distinction between langue and parole, and concluded, "He has given us the theoretical basis for a science of human speech." Different as American linguistics has become, it still keeps a link with Saussure. Like all productive thought, the Saussurean concept of language had consequences that were not immediately perceived. There is even a part of his teaching which remained unproductive and inactive for a long time. It is the part which relates to language as a system of signs, and the analysis of the sign into the signifier and the signified. That was a new principle, the one of the two-sided unit. In recent years, linguists have debated the notion of sign. To what extent do the two aspects correspond? How does a unit hold or split through diachrony, etc.? Many points of the theory are still to be discussed. Among others, it must be asked if the notion of the sign could be retained as a principle of analysis at all levels. We have stated elsewhere that the sentence as such does not admit of segmentation into units of the type of the sign. But what we wish to emphasize here is the scope of the principle of the sign when set up as a unit of language. From that, it results that language becomes a semiotic system. The task of the linguist, said Saussure, is to find out what makes language a special system within the mass of semiological data. But to me, the language problem is mainly semiological. We see that this principle is now gaining ground outside linguistics and penetrating into the sciences of men, which are becoming aware of their own semiotics. Far from language being swallowed up in society, it is society which is beginning to recognize itself as a language. Analysts of society ask themselves if certain social structures, or, in another context, those complex discourses which myths are, should not be considered as signifiers for which one has to search out the signified. These innovating investigations suggest that the basic characteristic of language, that it is composed of signs, could be common to all those social phenomena which constitute culture. It seems to us that one should draw a fundamental distinction between two orders of phenomena. On the one side, the physiological and biological data, which present a simple nature, no matter what their complexity may be, because they hold entirely within the field in which they appear and because their structures form and diversify themselves on successive levels in the order of the same relationships. On the other side, the phenomena belonging to the interhuman milieu, which have the characteristic that they can never be taken as simple data or defined in the order of their own nature, but must always be understood as double from the fact that they are connected to something else, whatever their referent may be. A fact of culture is such only insofar as it refers to something else. The day when a science of culture takes shape, it will probably be founded upon that chief feature, and it will develop its own dualities on the model Saussure gave for language, without necessarily conforming to it. No science of man will be spared this reflection on its subject and its place within a general science of culture, for man is not born in nature, but in culture. What a strange destiny ideas have, sometimes seeming to lead lives of their own, revealing or contradicting or recreating the figure of their creator. One could pause for a long time over this contrast. The actual life of Saussure compare with the fortunes of his ideas. A man alone in his thought for almost his whole life, unable to bring himself to teach what he deemed wrong or fanciful, feeling that it was necessary to recast everything but less and less tempted to do it, and finally, after many diversions that could not rescue him from the torment of his personal truth, imparting to a few students some ideas on the nature of language which never seemed to him to be matured enough to be published. He died in 1913, little known outside the narrow circle of his pupils and a few friends, even then almost forgotten by his contemporaries. Meillet, in the moving obituary he then devoted to him, deplored the fact that Saussure's life ended on an unfinished work. After more than 30 years, the ideas expressed by Ferdinand de Saussure in his early work have not exhausted their vitality, and nevertheless his disciples have the feeling that he has not held anything like the place in the linguistics of his time which his brilliant gifts deserved. And he ended with this poignant regret. Saussure had produced the finest book of comparative grammar that has ever been written. He had sown ideas and laid down firm theories. He had left his mark on numerous pupils, and still he had not completely fulfilled his destiny. 3 years after the death of Saussure, the Cours de Linguistique Générale appeared, edited from the notes of students by Bailly and Sécheray. In 1916, amidst the clash of arms, who could have been concerned with a book on linguistics? Nietzsche's saying that great events arrive on those feet was never truer. Today, 50 years have passed since the death of Saussure. 2 generations separate us from him, and what do we see? Linguistics now holds an important place among the sciences dealing with men and society, and is among the most active of them in theoretical research as well as in technical developments. And this new linguistics has its origins in Saussure, and it is in Saussure that it finds its bearings and takes shape. Among all the currents that cross it, among all the schools into which it is divided, the innovating role of Saussure is proclaimed. That seed of brightness, culled by a few disciples, has become a great light which reveals a landscape filled with his presence. What we are here asserting is that Saussure belongs henceforth to the history of European thought, a forerunner in doctrines which in the past 50 years have transformed the theory of language. He has opened up unforgettable vistas on the highest and most mysterious faculty of man. At the same time, in placing on the horizon of science and philosophy the notion of sign as a bilateral unit, he has contributed to the advent of formal thought in the sciences of society and culture, and to the founding of a general semiology. Taking in, at a glance, the half-century that has just elapsed, we can say that Saussure really did accomplish his destiny. Beyond his earthly life, his ideas spread further than he could have imagined, and his posthumous destiny has become, so to speak, a second life, which henceforth mingles with ours.